Many are the dreadful stories told of the Orcs, these ancient enemies of our people. But few who still linger on this Middle-earth still remember the whole truth of their origin. Who were they before they emerged from the black pits of Angband and Mordor with sword and axe and fire? Eldest of all the Allfather's children, we the elves awoke in darkness at the bay of Kuivienen, long ere the making of the sun. Though the elves awoke far from the light of Aman, they had the stars for comfort. Elbereth herself had kindled them for our benefit. And high in the northern sky she had set the Valakirka, the sickle of the Valar, in challenge to the Dark Lord on his dark throne. Among the elves there were three who knew no sire, Imin, Tata and Enel. These were the elf fathers, and to their three original clans all of our folk trace their lineage. In the young days of these fathers, we began speaking to each other and giving names to all we saw, and we called ourselves the Quendi, the speakers, for all was still and silent in the world except our singing voices. The elves in those days led simple lives, yet they still had fear, for the Valar, the lords of the world, dwelt across the sea, and Middle-earth was the domain of the great enemy, he whose true name we no longer speak. Morgoth he was later called, and he had named the world unto himself, and called himself King of all things. Morgoth, jealous of Manwë's lordship, sought in his malice to corrupt the elves against the Valar, so he sent out his twisted creatures to prey on those elves that strayed too far from safety. Dark shapes and shadows he sent to sow a fear of the dark and unknown, and sometimes he sent out black things in the shape of riders astride terrible horses. Thus, dark stories began spreading among the elves of the hunter on his fell steed that lurked in the shadow of tree and hill. Orome, the huntsman of the Valar, had taken to riding the wilds of Middle-earth. Astride his mighty steed Neha, the lord of horses, he looked much like the riding apparitions of Morgoth. Small wonder then that when he first happened on the Quendi, many of them were filled with fear and ran from his visage. Many of our kin saw the light of Aman on his face, and knew at once the love he held for them, and they greeted him without fear. But there were some who were not calmed, and instead ran and hid, or elsewise disappeared into the dark woods and were lost. A greater portion of the three clans welcomed Orome, and later journeyed west on the invitation of the Valar, and of their deeds and stories I shall tell at another time. For now we shall concern ourselves with those who ran into the darkness and were never seen again. We know not the full extent of their fate, or the width of their suffering at the hands of their cruel host, but we know Morgoth found them and locked them in the deepest, darkest pits of his stronghold Udun. Years uncounted passed, and they were forgotten, but generation after generation of plagued, lonely souls lived and died under torture deep beneath the earth, until finally, at long last, Morgoth had bred the vile race of the Orcs. This was his most evil act, though many other evils still he would visit on the world in the years to come. The sad fate of the Orcish race is that we still don't know how much of their elvish origin remained. They lead mortal lives after their own fashion, they multiply faster than us, and seem more prone to violence. Few elves would deign to suggest they foster culture or art in like manner to the Eldar, but they undoubtedly have some form of society. Do their Feas travel to Mandos in the undying west when their bodies die, as do all of our kind? And would they be truly fallen beyond redemption, were the influence of their masters severed? We know not, but it is said by some that the Orcs loathed above all others Morgoth, who they had only served for fear of their own demise. The Orcs now multiplied within the dungeons of Morgoth's strongholds Udun and Angband. But this was not to last for long, for the Valar, having heard about the coming of the elves, grew worried that the influence of Morgoth would put them in peril. So they came forth in strength and fought a terrible war against their ancient foe. So cataclysmic was this battle that the world was torn asunder, and the seas and mountains were unmade and remade, and the fiery hordes of Balrogs clashed with the starlit hosts of Maiar, until the skies blazed with light and rang with rolling thunder. The Quendi knew little of the war of the Valar, but they saw the fires in the north and heard the rumblings of the mountains. Finally, the doors of Udun were thrown open, and Morgoth was chained, and all his creations and servants were scattered to the winds. The Orcs fled, and so did the mighty Balrogs, and many other beasts besides, and even Sauron, Morgoth's chief lieutenant, was nowhere to be found. For many years peace reigned in Middle-earth. The elves spread and multiplied, and a greater part of them journeyed west to stay in Aman with the Valar. Some of these, of a kindred known as the Teleri, halted in the wide land of Beleriand, for their Lord Elve had become lost. When he emerged many years later, he had the Maya Melian at his side, and he was robed in silver. Thingol the Greycloak he was called, and his people became the Sindar. He claimed kingship over all Beleriand between the mountains and the sea, and in the heart of the great forest Doriath he made his home. This was an age of prosperity for the Sindar, and of friendship, for Thingol became swift friends with the dwarves of Nogrod and Belegost, and the green elves of Denethor, who took Osirian for home. And for many years no sign was marked of the creatures of Morgoth. But peace could not last forever. One day, the Dwarrow folk of Durin's house came to their friend Thingol, and he received them in the great halls of Menegroth, that they themselves had delved for him. The dwarves were troubled, for they had noticed a new fell folk emerging from the ruins of Angband and scouting the hills and fells to the north. Thingol now feared that the schemes of Morgoth were at work again, and he bade the dwarves craft weapons of war for his people. For in the art of metal shaping, the dwarves were unrivaled, for they had been well taught by Aule, their creator. Thingol's folk, the Sindar, now drew out of their woods and made swift war upon the Orcs. The fighting was short and one-sided, for these young creations of Morgoth were still leaderless and unorganized, and the forges of Angband and Udun still lay in ruin. These early scoutings and smaller sorties did not really challenge the elves, but it made them aware that things in Beleriand could swiftly change for the worse, and even the reclusive green elves made promises of martial aid if stronger foes should appear in the future. In the year 1495 of the First Age, Morgoth escaped his captivity and visited a terrible doom on all who dwelt in Aman, and many are the events that transpired there that reverberated into the coming ages. But of this I shall say only little, since they deserve a recounting of their own. But when all was said and done, Morgoth fled across the narrow ice and returned to Middle-earth. The Dark Lord now came to reside in Angband, where he brought all dark things to him, and ordered the delving of new pits and forges beyond count. The slag and rock and earth from this massive ordeal was reared into 3 mighty peaks far above the earth, the Thangorodrim, the mountains of tyranny. In this dark place, the Orcs multiplied anew, faster than ever before, and here they were outfitted in hauberk, mail, and pointed helm, and trained for soldiery. A large host issued forth from Angband, and came south into Beleriand from the highlands and mountain passes, and laid siege upon Doriath. Their numbers seemed unending, and the fury they visited upon the land was terrible to behold. But Thingol was not taken completely unawares, and sent word to his ally Denethor of Osirian. Therefore, the Orcs were caught on both sides by the armies of the Eldar, and a large battle began. Morgoth had underestimated the strength of Doriath and Thingol's folk. His army was swept away by the stout lines of elven spears and hails of arrows from skilled archers, and Thingol himself entered the fray, while Beleg and Mablung directed the swords and bows of the Marsh Wardens. But Denethor's folk were not a martial people, and the Orcs had weapons and armor from the forges of Angband. The Lord of the Green Elves fell back, and he and his men were encircled atop the hill of Amon Ereb, where the Orcs slew many. And in the heat of battle, Denethor too fell to the might of the Orcs. Thingol and his folk eventually rescued their beleaguered allies and drew off the last of the Orcs. These fled north, but were caught by a sortie of dwarves from the Blue Mountains. No Orc ever returned to Angband. This was the first battle of the Wars of Beleriand, the first time the might of the Orcs were truly tested. They had strength and cruelty in equal measure, but the elves of the elder days were mightier than they are now, when many of our folk have faded or passed into the west, and the greatest adversary of the Orcs and Morgoth's other foul creatures had just landed on the shores of Middle-earth. They bore the light of Aman in their eyes, and the wrath of fell oaths and fell deeds guided their swords. But the story of the High Elves I shall save for another day. Hi there, and thank you for watching my first Lord of the Rings lore video. I have already learned a ton and hope to make many more videos in the future. If you liked it, I would really appreciate a like and a subscription to my channel. If you have thoughts, please leave a comment below. I would be super curious if you think there are some interesting facts I omitted from the video. See you all in the next one.